Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the frigid, uncomfortable world of medieval peasants and their battle for warmth during the coldest winters. Imagine trudging through snowdrifts, shivering beneath layers of tattered clothing, and entering a home that barely offers shelter. The chill of the winter is constant, and it's not just the weather that threatens to kill you. It's the struggle for survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Post your location and local time. And let's share this moment together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The world outside your little wooden home is a wasteland. Barren and bitter. The winter months stretch endlessly before you, the nights drawing in long and dark. This is a reality that medieval peasants knew all too well. Suffocating cold, deathly still air, and a perpetual struggle to survive. You could count on one hand the comforts of your life, and warmth was never guaranteed. You didn't exactly have a cozy blanket awaiting you at night. No fuzzy slippers, no electric heaters. The only thing standing between you and the cold was your body, your fire, and sometimes the people and even animals around you. But the cold wasn't just an inconvenience. The winters were a terrifying force that could wipe out entire villages. Imagine having no insulation in your walls, no central heating, and only a small fire to keep you from freezing to death. That fire might give off enough heat to warm one small corner of your home, but the rest of the space? That was just a brutal, freezing no man's land. And speaking of that fire, have you ever stopped to think about just how much it did or didn't help? You're going to want to hold on to that thought because, trust me, medieval warmth was a lot more complicated than you'd think. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were better off or worse during the winter months compared to other historical periods. There's this romanticized view that people huddled around fires, bundled up in woolen blankets, and survived against all odds. The reality, however, is far from cozy. You could live in constant fear of freezing to death, or worse, not waking up at all. And let's not even talk about the smell. Your world, as a medieval peasant, is ruled by the rhythm of the seasons, especially winter. The days shorten and the nights stretch on. The weather, relentless and unforgiving, forces you to adapt in ways that people today can hardly imagine. Sleep, something that we now take for granted, was a matter of survival back then. You weren't just tired, you were fighting to make it through another night without succumbing to the freezing temperatures, dampness, or worse. Now, sleep might seem like a luxury today, but back then, it was a necessity. Without the warmth of central heating or even thick blankets, your bed was really your last line of defense against the elements. But it wasn't just about comfort. Your bed had to be your refuge, your survival space. So, let's talk about how you'd have prepared to sleep under these harsh conditions. And trust me, it's not what you'd expect. Back in medieval times, they didn't have the fancy memory foam or pillow-top mattresses we're used to. No, your bed was likely a simple wooden frame, perhaps with a few rough straw mattresses layered on top. And that wasn't for comfort. It was to help trap body heat. If you were lucky, you might have a feather pillow. But even that wasn't enough to fight off the cold that crept in from every corner of your home. What you needed was warmth, and you had to get creative with how you found it. Blankets made of wool or animal hides were used to trap heat. And let's not forget that these animals were likely living in your home, sharing the same space where you were trying to get some shut-eye. Historians still debate whether these makeshift bedding solutions were effective. Was sharing warmth with animals truly a survival tactic? Or did it just make the whole ordeal more uncomfortable? Some argue that the animals helped conserve body heat, but others say they brought in pests and illness. In any case, sleep back then wasn't about rest. It was about holding on to whatever warmth you could. Now, imagine all of that happening in a home with just 1 or 2 rooms, often shared by an entire family, possibly even a few animals. The space was cramped, noisy, and certainly not private. But despite all that, this was your bed, your sanctuary in a cold, harsh world. No TV, no gadgets, no soft pillows, just you, the people around you, and maybe a few animals trying to snuggle close for warmth. The cold was a constant enemy, but sleep was the ultimate luxury. And you didn't have the luxury of uninterrupted rest. The nights were filled with waking, turning, and adjusting to the cold, waiting for dawn to break and bring you some relief. Let's take a deeper look at where you actually lived, your humble peasant hut. When most people today think of a medieval home, they picture something that might resemble a cottage, complete with a warm hearth and perhaps a thatched roof. But for the vast majority of peasants, this home was far from a cozy retreat. Your house was more of a shelter than a living space, constructed with whatever materials were readily available, usually wood, mud, straw, and thatch. Imagine stepping inside one of these homes during the dead of winter. The floor is rough, probably covered with a few scattered straw mats or maybe just dirt. The walls are made of wattle and daub, basically woven branches coated in mud, so they offered very little insulation. As a result, the cold air would seep through every crack, making the space unbearably chilly, especially once the sun dipped below the horizon. And let's be clear, there was no home improvement store to run to for new insulation or materials. What you had was all you got. The only real source of warmth came from the fireplace. And I don't mean one of those grand stone fireplaces you might see in castles or modern homes today. No, this fireplace was a small hearth, often centrally located in the room, but the warmth it provided was fleeting and limited. On a good night, the fire might warm the area directly around it, but that didn't mean you could curl up in a cozy chair with a blanket. Instead, you and your family were likely crammed together near the fire, hoping to make it through the night without freezing. But was the fire really as helpful as we imagine historians argue? Whether the hearth was a true source of warmth or simply a psychological comfort? The truth is, while the fire provided some heat, it was never enough to heat a whole room, let alone the entire house. The fire was essential, of course. It was the only option, really. But it couldn't create a warm, welcoming environment. The rest of the house absolutely freezing. To make matters worse, the constant burning of wood in the hearth led to thick smoke that filled the room, creating another layer of discomfort. The smoke would often have to escape through a small chimney or flue, but many homes didn't have this feature, meaning the air inside could be full of ash and fumes. The fire was both your savior and your tormentor, keeping you warm while also suffocating the air you breathed. Historians still debate whether the smoke in these homes led to serious respiratory issues for the inhabitants. While we know it couldn't have been healthy, it's unclear just how much it affected peasants' long-term health. In any case, living in a house with a smoky, drafty fireplace wasn't exactly a dream come true. This, then, was your reality. No central heating, no insulation, no modern conveniences, just a fireplace that worked some of the time and a space where cold was your constant companion. And yet, despite all of this, people managed to survive, even if they didn't exactly thrive. But survival was the goal, wasn't it? Staying warm enough to make it through another brutal winter was your top priority, and every part of your home was an attempt to hold on to life in an unforgiving world. When you think about staying warm, the first thing that comes to mind is probably clothing. But medieval peasants didn't just toss on a coat and call it a day. Oh, no. Layering was an art form, and it wasn't about fashion. It was about survival. Layers were your only defense against the elements. You needed them to trap body heat, keep the cold from creeping into your bones, and prevent frostbite from setting in during the harshest winter months. The base layer was often made of linen, the most common material in medieval Europe. Linen was breathable, which meant it helped wick away moisture. But it didn't do much for warmth by itself. So, the trick was to pile on more layers over it. Next came wool, thick, dense wool. Wool retained heat even when it got wet, making it the ideal fabric for surviving in the cold. If you were lucky, you'd have a woolen tunic or cloak to keep the chill at bay. But lucky or not, wool was the go-to material, and it wasn't something you could just toss into the laundry every week. A good woolen cloak was a prized possession, often worn day and night. Then, of course, came the boots. Leather, often lined with wool or fur, was used for shoes and boots. The leather would help protect your feet from the wet and cold ground. But it wasn't enough on its own. So, over time, people started wearing thicker socks or even wrapping their feet in cloth or fur to add that extra layer of warmth. It wasn't just about style, though. It was practical. You needed every bit of protection against the frozen earth below. But here's where it gets interesting. While your clothing layers were essential for survival, they weren't perfect. Historians still argue about how effective they really were. On one hand, layers were a critical defense against the cold. But on the other hand, they could become cumbersome. Wearing so many layers limited your mobility, making it harder to work, move quickly, or even sleep without feeling trapped by your own clothes. And then there's the question of moisture, sweat. If you were wearing so much wool and leather, it was almost impossible to stay dry. And once those layers got damp, they didn't keep heat nearly as well. The other problem with all this layering, it didn't just keep you warm, it kept you stinky, too. Imagine being in those same woolen clothes day after day, week after week, without the benefit of a nice hot shower or even a proper bath. You'd get used to the smell. But others, not so much. Peasants didn't have much in the way of hygiene, and the combination of sweat, dirt, and smoke from the fire created an overwhelming scent. But in those days, it wasn't about cleanliness. It was about staying alive. The question remains, just how much did these layers really help in keeping the cold at bay? Some historians claim that they were essential to survival, while others suggest that the sheer bulk of layers might have made peasants more vulnerable to frostbite in some cases, especially if they didn't keep moving to warm up. Still, there's no denying that. At least when it came to clothing, every medieval peasant knew the struggle of balancing warmth with the weight of what they wore. And don't even get me started on those animal furs. You'd think that the fur-lined garments might have been a major bonus, right? But as with everything in medieval life. The furs came with their own problems: mice, insects, and just general discomfort. The kinds of furs that worked best for insulation often made their way into the homes, bringing more unwanted pests along for the ride. Now, imagine this. It's the dead of night, and you're struggling to sleep in your cold, crowded hut. You've layered on every bit of clothing you own, huddled as close to the hearth as possible. But the cold still seeps in, gnawing at your bones. But the night doesn't end there. You're not just resting. In the medieval world, sleep wasn't just for recharging. It was often interrupted by the harsh realities of survival. You weren't allowed the luxury of uninterrupted sleep. There were chores to be done, even as darkness fell. During the winter months, the days were short and the nights long. But this didn't mean it was time for peasants to rest. Instead, it was an odd, interrupted form of work-rest cycle. The problem was, nighttime wasn't just for sleeping. It was when people worked their hardest to make sure they survived. The cold didn't stop anyone from getting things done, especially when survival was on the line. And that means, even when most of us would be tucked up in our warm beds, medieval peasants were often still at it. For instance, there were things like tending to the animals. Even in the dead of night, a peasant might need to get up to check on the animals, especially if they were sharing your bed. The hearth, while offering some warmth, didn't provide enough light for you to work during the night. So you'd have to make do with candles or rushes. And once you're up to attend to the animals or stir the fire, sleep becomes an elusive concept. But that was only the beginning. The chores didn't stop. Tasks like mending tools, grinding grain, or preparing food could extend well into the night. While we think of nighttime as downtime, medieval peasants couldn't afford to rest when survival depended on constant upkeep. In fact, the harsh winters often demanded more work, not less. A lot of the work that took place during the winter months was about preparing for the long stretch of spring and summer. You'd have to think ahead to planting, tending to crops, and making sure everything was ready when the thaw finally arrived. Historians still argue whether this constant nighttime labor was a cultural norm or simply a matter of necessity. On one hand, it's believed that peasants often worked through the night because they had no other option. Daylight hours were too short to get everything done. But some suggest that this constant hustle was part of medieval life, a rhythm that left little time for rest or relaxation. You had to keep working, even when you'd rather just crawl back into your bed and sleep through the chill. There's also the issue of the segmented sleep cycle. Medieval peasants didn't get the kind of solid, continuous sleep that we now consider normal. Instead, they practiced what we now refer to as biphasic or segmented sleep. In other words, they'd sleep in two separate stretches, one from dusk until around midnight, and then another after a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. This was partly because the cold and the dark made it difficult to stay asleep for long periods, but it also fit in with the constant work pattern. During that wakeful period in the middle of the night, peasants would often get up and do things. Sometimes they'd work. Sometimes they'd just chat by the fire. Or perhaps they'd have a drink. This wasn't laziness. This was a way of coping with the rhythm of medieval life. It's thought that the first sleep period was usually shorter, lasting about 3-4 hours, and the second sleep period was longer, allowing you to rest for another 3 to 4 hours. Historians still debate how widespread segmented sleep was across different regions and times. Some argue it was universal. while others think it was a regional habit that arose from necessity, especially in places where winters were longer and harsher. But one thing is clear. The notion of sleep as a long, uninterrupted stretch of time was foreign to medieval peasants. So, the next time you're cuddled up in your warm bed, think about how hard it was to get any sleep back then. Instead of a peaceful, quiet night, it was a battle to stay warm, keep your home from freezing, and find those precious few hours of rest in between your many chores. By now, you've probably come to realize that medieval life wasn't exactly the cozy, restful existence many of us imagine. But what if I told you that the very thing you might rely on for warmth, the fire, wasn't as reliable as it sounds? A fireplace was crucial for survival, but it was hardly the savior it's often made out to be. Let's take a closer look at the hearth, the centerpiece of any medieval peasant's home, and what it really meant for warmth during those endless, brutal winters. Your fireplace wasn't a big, roaring flame that could heat your entire house. In fact, it was a small hearth, often built right into the center of the room or tucked against a wall. The fire did provide some warmth, of course, but it wasn't a miracle worker. The fire was more of a just enough to get by situation. Think of it like using a space heater that can only warm a small area. And your home is much bigger than that. You might sit near it to get some warmth. But the farther you were from the hearth, the colder it got. The rest of the house, especially the corners and the rooms away from the hearth, would remain cold and uninviting. But this fire wasn't only a source of heat. It also doubled as the heart of the home for cooking and light. It was a multitasker, and you needed it to survive in more ways than one. You didn't have electric stoves or ovens to bake bread or cook a hearty stew. No, you had to rely on the fire to prepare all your meals. But that's where things get tricky. While a fire might help with cooking, it also meant constant upkeep. You had to stoke it, add wood to it, and make sure it didn't go out. On a cold winter night, this wasn't something you could take for granted. Historians still debate how well medieval hearths actually performed in warming homes. While they certainly provided some relief from the cold, their inefficiency is undeniable. The fire was often not enough to heat more than one area of the home, and with the smoke rising and filling the room, it made the air thick and unpleasant. Many medieval homes lacked proper chimneys, meaning that smoke often billowed out into the living space. The air inside your home was always thick with the scent of burning wood and ash, which might have helped to mask the smell of the cold. Wet wool you were wearing, but it wasn't doing your lungs any favors. The fire also came with its own risks. If it wasn't carefully managed, a stray spark could set your thatched roof alight, and with the wind howling outside, the fire could quickly turn from your ally into a deadly enemy. Accidental fires were a real threat, and if they didn't burn down your home completely, they might at least ruin your chances of keeping warm during the night. Then there was the issue of food. Sure, the fire kept you warm enough to survive, but that was only if you had something to cook. The food situation in winter was often grim. Medieval peasants didn't have access to fresh food year-round, so they had to rely on stored grains, dried vegetables, and salted meat. If the fire went out, cooking was off the table, and so was the chance of getting enough nutrition to make it through the cold, dark nights. In the end, the hearth was both a blessing and a curse. It provided warmth when it worked, and it allowed you to cook, which was vital for surviving the winter months. But at the same time, it was difficult to manage, prone to going out, and even more prone to causing accidents that could cost you everything. So, while the fire was an essential part of medieval life, it wasn't a perfect solution. The reality of surviving the cold winters wasn't just about the warmth of the fire. It was about constantly battling the cold, the smoke, and the risk of danger from the very thing that was supposed to help keep you alive. A bit ironic, right? If you've made it this far through the frigid medieval landscape, you're likely starting to get a real sense of the struggle that peasants endured just to stay warm. Now, imagine this. You've layered on all the woolen clothing you can. You've huddled by the hearth as much as possible. And you're doing everything in your power to keep the cold at bay. But when night falls, you face another survival tactic that might seem strange, even uncomfortable: bundling. This wasn't just a way to stay warm, it was a way of life. Instead of each person having their own bed, peasants would bundle together for warmth. A family of 5, perhaps 6, would pile into one bed, under one big, heavy blanket, with each person pressed close to the others. This practice was a practical response to the cold. But was it really as cozy as it sounds? Well, imagine being sandwiched between your siblings, your parents, maybe even the occasional animal. All of you wrapped together for warmth. It wasn't about cuddling for comfort. It was about sharing body heat in a battle against the freezing air. Historians still debate whether this communal sleep was a genuinely effective tactic or just a necessary evil. On one hand, bundling helped conserve heat. The body heat from others could keep you warmer throughout the night, and it made the whole group less vulnerable to hypothermia. After all, in a world where staying warm could mean the difference between life and death, anything that helped preserve heat was essential. However, there were drawbacks. For one, it didn't exactly promote privacy. In fact, the lack of privacy could create its own set of problems, especially when it came to hygiene. Sharing a bed with multiple family members, and sometimes animals, might not sound like the healthiest arrangement. The close quarters meant that the spread of lice, fleas, and other pests was rampant. And if you were unfortunate enough to share your bed with farm animals, like pigs or goats, that meant even more pests and dirt. The smell was unbearable, and you didn't have the luxury of a proper bath or shower. Instead, you'd have to deal with the grime of your woolen layers, the residue of the smoky fire, and the stench of your close quarters. Hygiene was, to say the least, not a priority. But despite these inconveniences, bundling served a critical purpose. When it got down to it, survival was the priority, and this method of sharing body heat could mean the difference between freezing through the night or surviving until dawn. Of course, there's always the chance that the constant closeness led to a bit of friction within the family. But hey, when you're fighting for your life against the cold, perhaps that's just a small price to pay. Despite the less than ideal conditions, bundling was one of the few ways peasants could make it through the night. And for all its discomforts, it was surprisingly effective. The warmth from those around you, combined with the thick blankets, was enough to keep you from freezing, even if everything else around you was unbearably cold. That said, not everyone was thrilled about this communal approach to sleep. There are debates among historians as to how much the practice impacted relationships and family dynamics. Some argue it was a tight-knit, survival-driven bond that created a sense of solidarity within the family. Others suggest that it created tension, with people fighting for space or resenting the lack of personal space. But in the end, bundling wasn't about comfort or even peace of mind. It was about getting through the night, and for all the struggles that came with it. Bundling worked. It kept people alive during the coldest winters, allowing them to face the next day, no matter how bitter the cold might be. Now that you've bundled up and braved the fire and freezing cold, let's talk about an odd but common practice in medieval homes: sharing your bed with animals. Yes, you heard that right. While we might think of our pets as cute companions who sleep on the floor or in their own beds, medieval peasants often shared their sleeping space with animals. And this wasn't just an occasional occurrence. This was a regular part of their winter survival strategy. The cold was so overwhelming that every extra bit of warmth was necessary. And animals, especially livestock, could provide that precious heat. The most common animal companions in these shared beds were pigs, goats, and sometimes even chickens. The idea of snuggling up with a pig might sound absurd to modern sensibilities. But back then, it wasn't about cuddling for affection. It was about sheer survival. Livestock was often kept inside the home during the winter months to protect them from the bitter cold. The barn was no place for animals when temperatures plummeted, so bringing them inside meant they wouldn't freeze overnight. Now, imagine you're lying in bed, trying to sleep as best as you can in these freezing conditions, only to have a pig snoring or rooting around next to you. It's not the kind of cozy, peaceful sleep we're used to today. Instead, you might feel the warmth of the animals beside you. But it would come with a certain level of discomfort. The smells, the sounds, the constant movement. This wasn't exactly a dream scenario. However, in a world where survival depended on keeping warm at all costs, sharing your bed with an animal was just another way to cope. Historians still debate whether this practice was as effective as it sounds. On one hand, animals generate a surprising amount of heat. A pig, for instance, can warm a person's body temperature with its body heat alone. Goats, likewise, are surprisingly warm creatures. And in the dead of winter, every little bit of warmth counted. But on the other hand, sharing your bed with a pig or a goat could introduce a number of hygiene issues, not to mention the potential for pests, parasites, and disease. The animals weren't exactly bathed regularly, and they likely carried fleas, lice, and other unwanted guests into the bed with them. There's also the issue of the smell, with pigs in particular. You weren't exactly getting a fresh scent in your sleep. And given the lack of proper sanitation, you can imagine that these animals contributed to an overall unpleasant atmosphere in the home. But despite these discomforts, this practice was widespread. It wasn't uncommon for peasants to sleep next to animals, even though modern minds might recoil at the thought. Was it worth it? The debate continues among historians. Some argue that the warmth from the animals provided a critical lifeline, especially for those living in the harshest conditions. Others point out that the hygiene risks, combined with the discomfort of sharing your bed with animals, made it more of a necessity than a practical solution. But one thing is clear. When temperatures are dropping below freezing, you take any warmth you can get, even if it means lying next to a pig. At the end of the day, though, this was life in medieval Europe. People didn't have the luxury of choosing comfort over survival. The focus was always on staying warm enough to make it through the night. And if that meant sharing your bed with a farm animal, so be it. After all, if it kept you from freezing to death, you probably weren't going to complain too much. By now, you're probably beginning to appreciate just how difficult life was during the medieval winters. But there's one more piece of the puzzle when it comes to surviving the cold: food. And as with everything else, food during this time was less about indulgence and more about simple survival. The problem was, medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of fresh food year-round. Winter was a particularly lean time. If you were lucky enough to have stored enough food, you might scrape by, but there was no guarantee. You see, most peasants didn't have access to abundant stores of meat or fresh vegetables in the winter months. Instead, they lived off what they could preserve or store. The majority of their diet was based on grains, mostly barley, oats, and rye, either in the form of bread, porridge, or sometimes ale. Meat was a rarity for the average peasant, reserved for special occasions or saved as a treat when livestock was slaughtered. For most of the winter, your diet consisted of dried fish, salted meat, and vegetables that were preserved through pickling or drying. These foods didn't provide much in the way of nutrition, but they did help fill the stomach. The lack of fresh food was one of the biggest challenges of winter survival. While peasants had to rely heavily on grains and dried foods, these didn't provide enough of the vitamins and nutrients needed to keep the body in good health. Without vitamin C from fresh fruits or vegetables, scurvy was a common issue. This deficiency could leave your gums bleeding, your skin bruised, and your energy completely drained. The cold, coupled with poor nutrition, made the risk of illness a constant threat. Historians still argue how much the winter diet actually affected peasant health. Some believe that malnutrition played a bigger role in early deaths than anything else, while others argue that the high-carbohydrate diet of grains and bread provided enough energy to sustain them through the harsh winter months. But regardless of which side you're on, there's no denying that a lack of variety in the diet made winter months a delicate balancing act. But food wasn't just about keeping you alive. It also had an impact on your sleep. If you didn't have enough to eat, you weren't going to sleep well. Poor nutrition could lead to fatigue, irritability, and a general feeling of weakness that made it difficult to even rest properly. And during the winter, when daylight was scarce and you needed to get as much rest as possible, poor sleep was another challenge to overcome. And don't think the fire provided any real help in terms of food preservation. Without refrigeration, food storage was a challenge. Most of the time, you'd hang salted meats or fish in a cool, dry area or bury them underground to keep them from spoiling. For vegetables, the solution was drying or pickling them, which helped preserve them for months on end. But even with these methods, food supplies were limited. If your crops didn't yield enough in the fall, or if your preserved foods didn't last as long as you expected, you might find yourself hungry in the dead of winter, a threat that could derail any plans for survival. So, while you may have had the comfort of food storage to keep you going, it wasn't always enough. If you didn't manage to store enough food or your preserved items spoiled, winter could be an extremely lean time. Not having enough to eat meant not having the energy to work. And that, in turn, meant that preparing for the future, the next harvest, became a serious challenge. In the end, food was as critical to your survival as the clothes on your back or the fire in your hearth. Without enough to eat, you would find it harder to stay warm, stay healthy, and, most importantly, stay alive. For the medieval peasant, food wasn't just a comfort, it was a matter of life or death. Now that we've covered the extreme measures of warmth and survival, let's dive into the curious, often uncomfortable, sleep schedules medieval peasants had to follow. Today, when we think of sleep, we imagine a solid, uninterrupted stretch of hours where we can rest and recover for the next day. But back in medieval times, especially during the colder months, that wasn't the case. Sleep was broken up, segmented, and structured around the rhythms of survival. Medieval peasants didn't enjoy the luxury of a full, uninterrupted night's sleep. Instead, they practiced a sleep pattern that we would find odd today, one that included waking up in the middle of the night, and it was called biphasic sleep. Essentially, they slept in two distinct phases, one before midnight and another after a period of wakefulness. So, rather than getting one long stretch of sleep, you would have your first sleep, wake up for an hour or so, and then go back to sleep for a second stretch until morning. Historians are still unsure exactly why this was the case. Some suggest that it was simply a result of the harsh conditions that people lived in, with the cold keeping them awake and restless. It made sense to split the sleep into two periods. Others believe that it was more of a cultural practice based on the natural rhythms of the body. People would naturally wake up after a few hours of sleep, and instead of trying to force more rest, they would get up, do small tasks, or even socialize for a while before going back to bed. This mid-sleep wake time was not exactly restful. Though, you might get up to tend to the fire, check on the animals, or even perform small household chores like grinding grain or mending clothes. People often use this time for personal reflection or prayer, which shows just how deeply embedded religious practice was in their daily lives. The church, as a central part of medieval life, had its own take on how and when you should rest. And many peasants would use this time to engage in some sort of religious activity, perhaps even reciting prayers or contemplating their fate. Historians still argue about the specifics of this segmented sleep pattern. Was it due to the practicalities of life in the medieval world? Or was it tied to the rhythms of the human body? Some believe that this pattern was an essential part of how people survived the long, dark winters, while others think it was just a normal part of life back then, influenced by natural sleep cycles and societal needs. Whatever the reason, the impact on sleep was significant. While we today may have trouble imagining being awake for an hour in the middle of the night, for medieval peasants, this was simply how life worked. The two-phase sleep cycle meant that you weren't getting the uninterrupted rest we've come to rely on today. But it also meant you adapted to the rhythm of life. In fact, this biphasic sleep pattern was still common in many parts of the world until relatively recently. But let's not romanticize it. It wasn't like people woke up from their first sleep feeling refreshed and ready to take on the day. No, this was about getting whatever rest you could in between your chores and battles with the cold. It was a survival tactic in the truest sense of the word. If you didn't adapt to this broken sleep schedule, you might find yourself falling short on energy, or worse, exhausted and unable to keep up with the demands of the harsh winter life. So, while you might think of sleep as a time to fully rest and recharge, for medieval peasants, it was just another chapter in the ongoing struggle to survive the relentless winter nights. Sleep was essential, but it came in fragments, pieces of rest to keep you going, but never the full, peaceful night we dream of today. As we continue exploring the struggle for survival through those cold medieval nights, we come to a curious aspect of medieval life: the influence of the church on how peasants rested, or rather, how they didn't rest. You see, the medieval church didn't just dictate religious observances. It also had a significant impact on everyday routines, including sleep. The church, with its commandments and teachings, enforced a strict schedule that extended well beyond church services and fasting days. It also influenced when and how people should sleep. In the medieval world, the church had a profound effect on every part of your life, from your birth to your death, and that included sleep. In fact, Religious practices often dictated when peasants should rise and sleep. The concept of early to bed, early to rise wasn't just a health recommendation. It was a moral imperative. The church stressed the importance of following a strict daily schedule, and this included adhering to an early bedtime in alignment with religious ideals. Monasteries set the tone, as monks and nuns lived by the bell's toll. The idea was to rise early, at dawn, to pray and work, and then go to bed early in the evening after a full day of labor. The peasants, influenced by the same beliefs, were expected to follow similar patterns. But the truth was, not everyone could stick to this religious schedule, especially when survival was at stake. While the church might have hoped for everyone to follow a disciplined rhythm, reality often proved much messier. Historians still argue whether the church's influence on sleep was helpful or harmful to the peasants' well-being. On one hand, having a structured day might have helped people stay focused and productive, making sure they worked when necessary and rested when they could. But on the other hand, the pressure to conform to a rigid schedule could have caused stress or anxiety, especially during winter when days were shorter and the nights stretched endlessly. The church's ideal of sleep, centered around regularity and devotion, might have been out of sync with the realities of working the land, raising animals, and surviving the cold. The church also introduced a concept that had an interesting influence on sleep: the idea of prayer before bed, before you could rest for the night. There was often a spiritual ritual to perform. Whether it was praying for a good harvest, asking for protection from the elements, or seeking solace for a long, hard day, prayer was seen as essential before you closed your eyes. But what did this mean for your sleep quality? On the one hand, the act of prayer could offer comfort, helping to ease the mind and bring peace to a day filled with hardship. On the other hand, some historians suggest that the constant obligation to pray and the burden of guilt over failing to fulfill religious duties might have led to feelings of unrest, affecting the quality of sleep. Moreover, it wasn't just about rest and prayer. The church also imposed fasting periods and festivals that required even more disruption to daily routines. During fasting periods, you might be expected to sleep less and focus more on spiritual devotion, which meant that your body's natural need for rest was often overridden by religious expectations. This constant push to balance labor, prayer, fasting, and sleep could create a sense of exhaustion, not just from physical activity, but from the mental strain of trying to meet the church's expectations. Historians still debate the church's role in the overall well-being of medieval peasants. Some argue that it was a source of comfort, providing spiritual structure and a sense of purpose in a world that was otherwise harsh and unpredictable. Others suggest that the church's rigid structure, especially in matters of sleep and daily life, added stress and disrupted the necessary rhythm of rest that peasants needed to stay healthy. Was the church's influence ultimately a blessing or a burden? It's one of those historical questions that doesn't have a simple answer. But it certainly adds complexity to the experience of sleep in medieval times. As the night drew on, the church's influence loomed large. For peasants, sleep wasn't just a biological need. It was also a spiritual one. But with the cold, the work, and the constant pressure to balance everything, rest didn't come easily, even if you were following the church's guidance. The idea of rest and relaxation was tangled up in obligations, prayers, and duties that meant a full, peaceful night of sleep remained a distant luxury. Now that we've covered the essentials of warmth, food, and church-imposed schedules, let's take a look at something that might not immediately spring to mind when thinking about medieval life: the quality of the bed itself. I know. Sleeping in the medieval period doesn't sound like a dream come true. But let's talk about what they actually slept on. Because even in the most miserable of conditions, the bed itself played an important role in keeping you alive. The idea of a soft, cushioned mattress with memory foam and fluffy pillows is a modern luxury that medieval peasants didn't have the privilege of experiencing. Instead, their beds were rudimentary at best, and at worst, they were little more than a pile of straw thrown together on the floor. The frame, if you were lucky enough to have one, was often a simple wooden structure, and instead of a comfy mattress, you might sleep on a thick layer of straw, hay, or even rushes. These mattresses weren't meant to be comfortable. They were meant to provide some insulation from the cold. And that's about it. The cold ground underneath could sap warmth from your body overnight. And if you didn't have enough straw, it would be impossible to stay warm. But here's the kicker. The bedding, while sparse and uncomfortable, was one of the most important factors in how you survived the night. In a world where warmth was at a premium, the bed acted as a barrier between you and the freezing cold floor. That's why peasants would often layer their bedding with whatever they could find. Straw, wool blankets, animal skins, and even worn-out clothing. The more layers, the better. A thick covering of straw, packed tightly to act as insulation, was crucial in keeping the warmth in. And the more layers of clothing and furs you added on top of that, the better your chances of staying warm enough to sleep. But there was a major downside to this makeshift bedding system: hygiene. Without proper cleaning, the straw beds quickly became infested with pests. Lice, fleas, and bed bugs were the least of your concerns. Over time, the bedding would begin to smell and rot, making it a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. In fact, the bed itself could become a major health risk. But in those times, what was the alternative? There were no laundromats, no ways of sanitizing your bedding, just an endless cycle of discomfort and survival. The debate around medieval bedding is one that scholars still engage in. Some suggest that, despite the discomfort and lack of cleanliness, the straw mattress and thick blankets were effective at insulating against the cold, even if they couldn't completely eliminate the issues of pests or rot. Others argue that the unhygienic conditions led to a higher risk of infection and disease, which ultimately affected peasants' health and well-being. Historians are still torn on how much the state of these beds contributed to the overall struggles of peasant life. But it's clear that the humble medieval bed played a huge role in how well you could endure those long winter nights. The real challenge, though, was the lack of proper warmth. Sure, the straw helped with insulation, but it wasn't enough to keep the cold at bay for long. And the idea of a warm, cozy bed that enveloped you in softness was a fantasy. You didn't sink into fluffy pillows after a hard day's work. Instead, you likely lay on your side, huddling up as best as you could against the cold, trying to share body heat with those around you. Historians argue whether the medieval peasant's mattress provided real warmth or just an illusion of comfort. While it's true that the bedding was effective to some extent, it wasn't nearly as reliable as the warmth of a modern mattress or thick quilt. The truth is, you probably spent more time worrying about the cold than actually trying to get a restful sleep. The quality of the bed was simply not a priority in the medieval world. Keeping warm was the priority. So, next time you crawl into your plush bed and adjust your pillows, take a moment to appreciate what we have today. Those soft sheets, warm blankets, and cushioned mattresses would have been unimaginable luxuries for medieval peasants. who had to make do with whatever they could scrounge together to survive the long, cold nights. After everything we've covered, bundling together, the smoky hearth, and the uncomfortable bedding, there's one more issue that plagued medieval peasants, and it's one that most of us take for granted today. Hygiene. You might be thinking, sure, they didn't have modern bathrooms, but did it really matter that much? Well, it turns out that hygiene, or lack thereof, was a huge problem, and it didn't just affect your general health. It also played a role in how well you could sleep through the night. And let's just say that fresh wasn't exactly part of the medieval vocabulary when it came to personal cleanliness. Imagine this. You've spent a long, hard day working the land, tending to animals, hauling wood, or maybe even fending off the cold by huddling close to the hearth. When nighttime rolls around, you probably won't be able to wash off the day's grime. In fact, you probably wouldn't be able to wash at all, unless you had access to a local river or a communal bathhouse, which was rare for the average peasant. Most peasants didn't have the luxury of hot water, soap, or even basic hygiene supplies. The concept of a daily shower, or even weekly baths, wasn't on the menu. Instead, personal hygiene was often limited to quick rinses with whatever water you could gather from a well, river, or stream. And even then, it wasn't easy to keep yourself clean in the winter months, when water sources would often freeze over or become too far to reach. So, in cold weather, you relied on wiping down with cloths or occasionally using a bowl of water to freshen up. This was your reality, and in many cases, you'd go weeks, maybe months, without the benefit of a proper wash. Now, let's talk about the real downside. The bugs. With no modern cleaning methods, pests like lice, fleas, and bed bugs were common problems. The lack of hygiene made it easy for these pests to thrive, especially in the bedding and clothing that was rarely washed. Imagine spending your night trying to sleep with the constant itch of lice burrowing into your scalp or fleas jumping from person to person in the middle of the night. The smell of sweat, dirt, and the smoke from the fire filled the air, making it almost impossible to get a decent night's rest. Historians still argue how much the poor hygiene contributed to illness. Some believe it led to rampant diseases like the plague, while others suggest it was a constant source of discomfort, affecting peasants' ability to get any real rest. What we do know is that medieval hygiene was minimal at best. The stench of unwashed bodies mixed with the smell of animals in the home could create an unbearable atmosphere. If you weren't getting enough rest due to the cold or the discomfort of a shared bed, it's safe to say that the bugs, dirt, and general lack of cleanliness didn't exactly help. But the hygiene issue didn't stop at personal cleanliness. It extended to the entire living environment. Without the ability to properly clean your home, the accumulated filth, dirt, food scraps, animal waste, would fester. This meant that your living quarters were probably infested with insects and rodents, making it a difficult place to truly rest. The smell alone was enough to make sleep even more difficult. And yet, this was normal for peasants. You adapted to it because you didn't have a choice. There was no escaping the constant cycle of dirt, pests, and the cold. The harsh conditions forced you to focus on survival, with little time or energy left for anything resembling comfort or hygiene. Historians continue to debate whether the lack of cleanliness led to long-term health consequences. Some argue that the spread of disease was exacerbated by unsanitary conditions, while others contend that the constant exposure to these elements actually helped build immunity. One thing is for certain: the discomfort, the cold, the smell, and the presence of pests made sleep a challenge. It wasn't just about fighting the chill of the night or the fatigue of a hard day's work. The pervasive dirt and disease only added to the list of obstacles standing between you and a peaceful night's rest. So, while you're drifting off to sleep tonight in your clean sheets, take a moment to think about the medieval peasant's struggle to sleep. Hygiene wasn't a luxury. It was an afterthought. Sleep was precious, but it came with layers of discomfort, pests, and the ever-present reminder that survival wasn't about ease. It was about enduring. Now, with everything you've endured so far, freezing cold, meager food, uncomfortable sleep, and even the lack of hygiene, it's time to shift focus a little and consider something equally crucial to survival: the mindset of the medieval peasant. Sure, you've been fighting the elements, battling pests, and working tirelessly from dawn to dusk. But at the heart of it all was a constant, unshakable drive to survive. This wasn't just about enduring the cold nights or making it through another long winter. It was about holding on to hope and maintaining a will to live in a world that often seemed indifferent to your struggles. When we think of medieval peasants, we often imagine people who simply went through the motions of life, day in and day out. But surviving harsh winters in a medieval society required a resilience that went beyond physical endurance. Your mindset, your ability to keep pushing forward despite constant discomfort, was just as essential as your ability to gather firewood or maintain your meager food supply. In a world where death was always lurking just around the corner, whether from disease, famine, or the cold, the mental fortitude required to survive was something no one could take for granted. The question historians still grapple with is whether medieval peasants had a particular outlook on life or survival that made it easier for them to endure these hardships. Was it a kind of fatalism that allowed them to accept suffering as a part of life? Or was there something deeper, a sense of determination to push through and make it to the next season? The answer is complicated. There's evidence that medieval peasants had a strong sense of community and that helped them get through the toughest times. In a world where survival depended on the work of many, peasants often leaned on each other. They would come together to help with tasks like harvesting, building, or even tending to animals. This sense of solidarity was vital for enduring the harsh winters. Knowing that you weren't facing the cold alone, even if it meant sharing a bed with an animal or another person, could make a world of difference. However, even with that sense of community, life was still brutally hard. The fear of death, from disease, famine, or freezing to death, was a constant. And yet, there was also a certain stoicism about it all. It's likely that many peasants accepted suffering as an inevitable part of their existence. After all, if you didn't keep going, what was left? You had to keep pushing through the cold, keep working, and hope that the next day would be better than the last. There was no real luxury of taking a break or retreating to a warm bed for comfort. Comfort was a distant idea that didn't have much place in the brutal reality of medieval survival. Historians still debate whether this mentality, this mental resilience, was what made the medieval peasant so capable of surviving the brutal winters. Some suggest that this mindset wasn't unique to peasants, but was a part of the broader medieval worldview, where hardship and suffering were just part of the divine order of things. Others believe that peasants had a unique psychological response to their environment, a coping mechanism that allowed them to keep going in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Either way, there's no doubt that the mindset of the medieval peasant was a crucial part of the survival equation. But survival didn't always equate to thriving. The cold, the discomfort, the lack of privacy, and the constant battle against disease and pests were simply the backdrop to everyday life. The resilience to keep moving forward wasn't born of hope for a better life, but rather out of necessity. You didn't survive because you expected things to improve. You survived because you had to. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight in your warm, comfortable bed, take a moment to reflect on the mental strength that it took for medieval peasants to survive their nights. It wasn't just the freezing cold that made survival difficult. It was the constant mental strain, the knowledge that every night could be your last, and that each day brought with it the unrelenting grind of survival. In the end, it was this resilience, this refusal to give in, that kept them going, even when everything else seemed to be stacked against them. Now that we've explored the cold, discomfort, and relentless struggles that came with medieval life, let's take a moment to wind down and reflect on the broader picture of survival during those long, harsh winters. We've learned how peasants fought for warmth, for food, and for rest, facing challenges that seem almost unimaginable to us today. Their lives were not defined by comfort or luxury, but by endurance, by the constant will to push through the hardships that were a part of their daily existence. But as we ease into the final moments of this journey, it's time to think about how, despite all of this, survival wasn't just about making it through the cold months. It was about holding on to life in a world that was as much about resilience as it was about chance. Think about it. In today's world, we have the luxury of central heating, warm beds, and the promise of food and water in every season. But for medieval peasants, survival was a fragile thing. Each winter posed a new threat. The cold was never just an inconvenience. It was a potential killer. The lack of food was a real possibility. And diseases like the plague or malnutrition-related illnesses could strike when least expected. Yet, despite these overwhelming odds, peasants managed to survive. They adapted, they innovated, and most importantly, they helped each other. Throughout this entire process, there's one constant theme. Survival wasn't just about physical resilience. It was also about mental resilience. The harsh conditions could have easily broken their spirits. But the very nature of medieval society, the reliance on community, the shared experiences of hardship, helped individuals endure. They didn't have modern comforts or psychological support systems. But what they did have was a mindset honed by years of struggle. They didn't view each challenge as something to overcome, but as a part of their daily existence. What stands out about medieval peasants is not that they thrived in the face of adversity. It's that they simply refused to give in. There was no quitting in medieval life. Even when it felt like the cold, the hunger, and the constant battle against nature might consume you, survival became the only option. And it's this kind of tenacity that makes their story, though harsh and uncomfortable, deeply inspiring. As we wrap up tonight's journey, consider the comfort you now have, your bed, the warmth of your room, and the safety of your home. We often take these things for granted, but it wasn't always like this. The peasants of medieval Europe didn't have the luxury of soft blankets or warm homes, yet they survived and found ways to navigate the darkest, coldest winters. They learned to adapt to their environment, to share warmth in ways we might find strange, and to keep moving forward even when the world seemed to offer little hope. So, as you close your eyes tonight, think about those medieval peasants, huddled together in a cold, dark room, battling the harsh winds and the freezing temperatures. their resilience to face another night in discomfort, in darkness, and in cold is a reminder that even in our toughest times, we too can find ways to endure, to adapt, and to survive. Now, dim the lights and let the soothing rhythm of the night take you into your own peaceful sleep, knowing that while your world may be far more comfortable than the one we've discussed tonight, the strength of the human spirit remains timeless. As we continue through these harsh, cold medieval winters, there's one thing that stands out as not just a convenience, but an absolute necessity: firewood. In fact, firewood wasn't just about creating warmth. It was at the core of survival during those long months. Without fire, life in the medieval world would have been unimaginable. It wasn't simply an option, it was a lifeline, and every peasant knew it. First off, let's talk about how you actually obtained firewood. While it might seem like a simple task, just go out and chop some trees, getting firewood wasn't always easy. For most peasants, gathering wood was a time-consuming, grueling chore. You didn't have access to large forests or managed lumber yards like we might today. Instead, you relied on local forests, often marked by strict ownership rules. Gathering firewood in forests that belonged to lords could lead to severe consequences, so it was crucial to know your boundaries. However, that didn't stop peasants from taking what they could, often in the dead of night, sneaking off with smaller branches or fallen trees to bring back home. It was a necessary risk, because without firewood, you were at the mercy of the cold. But once you had your firewood, the battle wasn't over. The fire had to be maintained throughout the winter months, which meant constant effort to keep the hearth burning. This wasn't just a light the fire and forget about it situation. The hearth needed constant tending. Peasants would have to constantly feed it with more wood, adjust the logs to keep the fire from dying down, and ensure that the air circulating around it didn't cool down too much. A house without fire was not just cold, it was dangerous. The fire acted as a shield against frostbite, a source of warmth to cook food, and a light to fend off the encroaching darkness of winter nights. Historians still argue about the true importance of firewood in medieval life. Was it just essential for warmth and food? Or did it play an even deeper role in community and psychological survival? Some suggest that the act of maintaining the fire was a kind of ritual that kept families and communities together. Gathering around the hearth, feeding it together, was something that allowed people to focus on the here and now instead of the harsh reality of their environment. It gave them a sense of agency over their environment, even if the cold outside was ever present and merciless. Then, there was the issue of the wood itself. In a world where wood was a precious resource, it had to be used wisely. There were no conveniences like gas or electric heating. Everything had to be sustainable. Peasants had to find and chop enough wood to last them the entire winter. It was back-breaking work, requiring long hours in the forest, sometimes under harsh conditions. Families would stockpile their firewood before the deep freeze set in, but they couldn't always predict how much they would need. So, firewood wasn't just about staying warm, it was about staying alive. The role of firewood was integral not only for survival, but also for morale. It offered light during the long, dark winter nights and warmth that kept families from freezing. In this way, firewood wasn't just a resource, it was a constant reminder that survival was possible, as long as you had it to keep you going. Imagine the first frost, creeping in after the last days of autumn. The earth, once rich and fertile, now lies under a hard, icy crust, locking away any hope of fresh food for the coming months. The cycle of medieval agriculture hinged on these seasons, and winter was often the hardest, when the temperatures dropped. Life slowed to a crawl, and survival came down to what you'd managed to store or preserve before the chill set in. For medieval peasants, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a threat to your food supply. The months before winter were crucial for stockpiling everything needed to make it through the lean months. You'd need to harvest your crops, and if you were lucky, you'd get to preserve enough to last through winter. But no matter how well you prepared, the risk of famine was always hanging over your head. The typical peasant diet was not exactly varied, especially in winter. Grains like oats, rye, and barley were the staples of medieval meals. These were dried or stored for the winter months, often in root cellars or lofts, where the cool, dry conditions kept them from spoiling. But what you stored could only last so long. So, when the cold months stretched on, the worry was always about running out of food, of having to stretch your stores to the limit. Every last scrap counted. Even small amounts of grain could mean the difference between going hungry and surviving. Meat was a luxury for most peasants, but it was an important part of the diet when available. Some peasants were lucky enough to have livestock to slaughter in the winter, providing a small amount of protein that would see them through. However, this was never guaranteed. If the harvest didn't go well, or if the livestock fell sick, you'd be left with nothing but the bare essentials. Dried fish, salted meats, and pickled vegetables might fill the gap, but none of it was fresh. If you were unlucky enough to face a bad season, or if your preserved foods didn't last, you'd be left to fend for yourself in a world that wasn't kind to the hungry. And then there was the weather itself. Winter didn't just mean the cold, it also meant snow, ice, and the occasional heavy storm that would freeze the crops in place. The ground, once rich with vegetables, would become a frozen, impenetrable mass that prevented you from planting or harvesting anything new. All your hard work through the year had to be enough to get you through, and that often meant fighting to preserve what you had before it spoiled or was lost to the elements. Historians still argue about the true scope of medieval food preservation techniques. Some believe that the methods used to dry, pickle, or store food were effective enough to see peasants through the cold months. Others suggest that many were underfed, and that malnutrition was a silent killer that only made the cold harder to endure. In any case, the fear of running out of food was a constant companion during the winter months. This cycle of food scarcity and preservation dictated the pace of life for peasants. It wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about making sure you had enough food to survive the long stretch of dark, freezing nights. In those final months before the next harvest, every meal was a reminder of how much you depended on your ability to preserve and store what little you had. You could survive the cold, but only if your food stores held out. As the winter stretched on, the land became a cold, barren place, where hope was pinned on the next season's harvest. The winter of the land wasn't just about the cold. It was about knowing that every day you made it through without running out of food brought you one step closer to spring and the renewal of life in the fields. Surviving the brutal medieval winters wasn't just about staying warm and finding food. The cold, the constant dampness, the poor hygiene, and the malnutrition took a toll on the body in ways that were hard to ignore. The physical strain of enduring harsh winters was something that every peasant lived with. And it wasn't just about shivering under layers of wool or hoping the fire didn't go out. The body, already weakened by the cold and lack of proper food, became vulnerable to a variety of illnesses that could strike without warning. Imagine the strain your body would be under. Your muscles are sore from hauling wood, your hands cracked and raw from handling frozen earth, and your joints stiff from the cold. As you sleep, you're curled into a tight ball, trying to keep every inch of your body warm. But the blankets are thin and the floor hard. In these conditions, the body begins to break down over time. The cold takes away the body's ability to fight infections, and the lack of rest only makes things worse. Frostbite was a constant threat in the winter months. The hands, feet, ears, and nose were particularly vulnerable to frostbite, as they were often the first parts of the body exposed to the cold. If you worked outdoors or had to leave your home to gather firewood, chances were high that your extremities were exposed to freezing temperatures for long periods of time. If a frostbite set in, it could lead to permanent damage, and in some cases, the loss of fingers or toes. For medieval peasants, there was no quick solution to frostbite. You couldn't just go to a doctor for treatment. You had to rely on whatever folk remedies were available, and often, that was little more than wrapping the affected area in wool or applying herbal poultices. Scurvy was another common problem, especially in the winter, when fresh food was hard to come by. Without enough vitamin C, the body would start to break down. The gums would bleed, the skin would bruise easily, and a general feeling of weakness would overtake you. Scurvy was a slow, painful illness that weakened the immune system and made you more susceptible to other infections. But for medieval peasants, there was no real cure for scurvy. They had no knowledge of vitamin deficiencies, and fresh fruits or vegetables were scarce, especially in winter when the ground was frozen and crops had long been harvested. If scurvy took hold, it could seriously compromise your ability to survive, making even the most basic tasks feel impossible. The lack of proper hygiene compounded these issues. Without proper baths or the means to clean themselves, peasants were exposed to a variety of skin infections, lice, and other parasites. Lice and fleas would infest the woolen clothing that kept them warm, and bedbugs made sleep even harder. In homes filled with animals, the presence of fleas and mites would only increase the chance of disease. With no antibiotics, no medicine to relieve pain, and no real understanding of how disease spread, peasants were left to suffer through it all, hoping they had enough strength to pull through. Historians still debate how much these health issues affected the lives of peasants during the winter. On one hand, there were strong community bonds that helped people endure and often provide care for each other when illness struck. But on the other hand, the isolation of medieval life meant that if someone fell seriously ill, they were left to battle it alone, without access to doctors or the ability to get medical help. It was often a matter of waiting to see if the illness would run its course or if it would be fatal. Ultimately, the physical toll of medieval winters wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about how the body, weakened by the constant exposure to harsh conditions, eventually gave way to disease and injury. The body was the last battleground, and without modern medical knowledge or comfort, it was a daily fight against the elements and the ailments that came with them. When we think about the struggles of medieval peasants, we often focus on the physical challenges, the freezing cold, the lack of food, and the discomfort of living conditions. But perhaps one of the most difficult, yet overlooked, aspects of survival during the harsh winters was the impact on family dynamics. In such a confined space, with constant physical discomfort, emotional stress, and the ever-present threat of illness or death, the family unit became both a source of support and at times, a pressure cooker of tension. The medieval family structure was tight-knit, especially during the winter, with the cold keeping everyone indoors for longer periods of time, and the long nights stretching on. You were forced to share everything: the space, the food, the warmth. Everyone piled into the same small room or huddled around the fire, with little to no privacy. For most peasants, this communal living wasn't a matter of choice, but necessity. The family's survival depended on being as close together as possible, both for warmth and for pooling resources. But as you can imagine, this constant proximity had its challenges. With so many people sharing such limited space, tensions could run high. The cold was an ever-present enemy, and it brought out the best and worst in people. Tempers flared over the smallest things, fighting over food, arguing over who should tend the fire, or competing for the best spot near the hearth. While communal living had its advantages, it also came with a cost. The constant pressure of survival meant that personal needs and desires often took a back seat to the greater need for survival, leading to stress and frustration. The close quarters also meant that personal privacy was almost non-existent. For families, especially those with children, the boundaries between individuals could become blurred. Imagine being constantly in the presence of your family, with no room to escape. Not even for a moment of solitude. This was especially hard for the women, who had to juggle household chores, child rearing, and food preparation with little to no help. Without modern conveniences, the task of managing a household was an exhausting, unrelenting job. The responsibility for survival often fell disproportionately on the shoulders of the women, creating further strain within the family unit. But it wasn't just the physical challenges of living together that put pressure on the family. There was also the psychological toll of living under constant stress. The fear of illness, the constant uncertainty of food supplies, and the ever-present threat of death created an atmosphere of anxiety that was difficult to escape. Family members knew that every winter could be the last. The cold, the scarcity of food, the diseases that spread so easily in cramped conditions, it all added up to a heavy mental burden. This fear was compounded by the lack of understanding of disease or medicine. When someone fell ill, there was little to be done except wait and pray. The threat of death loomed over every family, and in some ways, it was easier to simply accept it as part of life. Historians still argue about how the family unit managed to survive during these difficult times. On one hand, the close-knit nature of the family provided a network of emotional and practical support that helped people endure the harshest of conditions. The family helped provide warmth and care, both physical and emotional, during times of hardship. But on the other hand, the pressures of constant togetherness and survival could lead to tension and conflict. In many ways, the family had to constantly adapt to the circumstances around them, balancing survival with the emotional and psychological costs that came with it. The importance of community cannot be overstated, either. In medieval villages, families often helped one another survive through the winter, sharing food, offering assistance with chores, and taking turns watching over the children were common ways to support each other. These shared responsibilities often extended to a larger network of extended family and neighbors, creating a web of interdependence that was vital for survival. Without this support network, it's hard to imagine how peasants would have made it through the long, cold winters. As we look at the family unit during this period, it's clear that surviving the winter wasn't just about physical survival. It was about navigating the emotional and psychological strains that came with being locked in close quarters, managing stress, and dealing with the constant uncertainty of life. The family unit, for all its tension, was a critical part of the survival strategy, offering the strength to carry on and the solace of companionship in the face of overwhelming adversity. In a world where every day was a struggle to stay warm, find food, and stay alive, medieval peasants often turned to rituals to help them cope with the harsh winters. These weren't just religious ceremonies. They were a lifeline, a source of comfort and meaning in a life that was often filled with hardship. Whether through religious observances, folk traditions, or community gatherings, rituals provided peasants with a sense of control over their lives in a world that often felt beyond their power. Religion played a central role in daily life for medieval peasants, and it also shaped how they approached the cold, the dark winters. The church provided a structured rhythm to the day, offering hope and comfort, especially during the darkest months. Prayer, fasting, and church attendance were part of the fabric of medieval life. The belief that one's survival was in God's hands provided a sense of solace, even if the world around them was filled with suffering. During the winter, the church calendar took on special significance. Feast days and religious festivals punctuated the bleak months, offering a moment of reprieve from the daily grind. Christmas, for instance, marked a time of spiritual celebration, and the church provided a communal space for peasants to gather, share in the joy of the season, and focus on the divine. For many, these religious celebrations provided a much-needed emotional lift. Despite the physical cold and hunger, these rituals offered warmth for the soul, reminding peasants that there was more to life than just survival. These rituals, with their deep roots in tradition, gave people the strength to keep going, to believe that better days might be on the horizon. But beyond the church, folk traditions also played an important role in how peasants survived the winter months. Superstitions and local customs provided a sense of agency in a world where much was out of their control. For example, Darnsamas, during the long nights, peasants might light candles to ward off evil spirits or use charms and amulets believed to protect them from illness. These small rituals gave people something to hold on to when the cold and uncertainty felt overwhelming. One such tradition involved making spirit bread, a form of offering meant to placate any mischievous spirits or deities that might cause harm to the harvest or the household. The bread was placed in a corner of the home or outside the door to ensure a safe, prosperous year ahead. Such rituals were less about actual belief in divine intervention and more about offering a psychological cushion, a small act of control amid the chaos of life. And let's not forget the medicinal rituals that were part of everyday life. Without modern medicine, medieval peasants relied on herbal remedies and folk cures to address everything from colds to broken limbs. These homegrown remedies, passed down through generations, were a form of ritualized survival. Herbal teas, poultices, and the burning of specific herbs were believed to protect the family from illness or to cure sickness when it struck. While many of these remedies were based on superstition rather than science, they served a practical purpose. They offered hope and a sense of control when traditional medical help was unavailable. In these small, often intimate rituals, peasants found ways to manage the constant stress and anxiety of life in the medieval world. When you live in a world where death is never far away, where cold winters and poor health seem like an ever-present threat, rituals serve as a way to reaffirm life itself. They gave peasants the strength to continue, to persevere, even when survival seemed like an endless struggle. Historians still argue about the true significance of these rituals. Were they a vital part of maintaining mental and emotional health? Or were they merely distractions that helped people avoid facing the brutal reality of their lives? Some suggest that these traditions were essential for mental survival, offering a sense of control, purpose, and connection in a world that could otherwise be isolating and harsh. Others suggest that they were a form of coping mechanism, a way to find meaning in a life that, for many, lacked material comforts. Whatever their true purpose, these rituals played a significant role in the lives of medieval peasants. In the face of freezing cold, poor food supplies, and the constant threat of disease, they offered a glimmer of hope. They were a way to assert control over life's hardships, to find comfort in the darkness, and to keep moving forward, even when the world seemed determined to make survival difficult.